Welcome to the UNU website, and thank you for joining us. Today in Tokyo, we have with us Thant Myint-U, who is a Burmese historian, scholar, activist, preservationist when it comes to heritage, and a man who has returned to his country at a time of transition, who has written about the history of his country in a variety of ways. A book called The River of Lost Footsteps several years ago had huge international pull. It's a wonderful read. It mixes personal history with wider history. You might think this wouldn't work. It works magnificently in this book. And subsequently, amongst many other books Thant has published, he published a book called Where China Meets India, which is about Burma or Myanmar's neighborhood, the two big neighbors, although Myanmar has other neighbors as well, Thailand, Bangladesh, and so on. And that was a wonderful book because it forced us all to think about Myanmar in its own context rather than in terms of our preoccupations with Myanmar. So a great book, very warmly received in the region and internationally. We're going to talk in a public session a bit later today about the transition, an accelerated, really, transition in Myanmar. For so long, perhaps the country itself, but certainly international observers of the country, had felt that it was somehow frozen in time, in a sort of glacial confrontation between forces at play in Myanmar that most of us didn't understand at all well. And then all of a sudden, it seemed, there was an opening up. And I want to start there, Thant, and ask you what you think provoked that opening up.
I think in a way, I mean, first of all, thank you very much for having me, David. I think in a way it was that lack of appreciation of the dynamics that were already there, even at a time when it seemed from the outside, especially from the West, that very little was happening inside the country. So I think in a way that image of Myanmar, even before the transition began, as a place that was entirely static, where nothing was changing or had changed, was wrong. I think part of the changes go back quite a long ways. I mean, the army, in a way, since the 1990s and the beginning of the writing of this constitution, was looking, in a way, for a method to step back from the day-to-day governments of the country. So I think this constitutional framework is something that actually goes back 15 or even 20 years. Then you have General Thant Myint-U, who was the autocrat of the country for many years. I think many of us sometimes looked at the situation incorrectly as a junta government, yes, implying a collective leadership, where it was really very much the rule of one man. And I think when that one man decided to retire, it was bound to lead to a power vacuum and some sort of shake-up of the political system. But I think more important than anything else was the fact that by 2010, 2011, everyone in the country, including in the political elite, including in the army, realized how far back the country was falling from the rest of the region economically and in so many other ways. And I think it was that sense of shame at having fallen back so far and a desire to catch up that I think provided the intellectual environment for a lot of the changes we see today.
I always wondered at the time whether there might have been a fear, even amongst the military, of falling too much under the economic sway of one country, China, and wanting to open up to others in part, as many countries want to do, to hedge their bets with any particular partner by having other partners.
I think that was certainly a factor. I think the imposition of Western sanctions and the boycotts beginning in the 1990s pushed the government in a position that it didn't really want to go, which was an over-dependence on a couple of countries, primarily China, but to some extent a couple of other countries in the region as well, at the expense of a lot of other countries that they wanted to have at least strong economic ties to in the West, in the United States, in the EU, Japan, and other countries. But I think it was just one factor.
Yes.
The lack of electricity was another factor. I mean, there were many other things that I think made people feel that this wasn't the optimum situation. That there was no reason Myanmar had to be so poor and so far behind, and in that particular situation that it found itself in. And I think when change began to come, it was almost inevitably going to be in the direction of greater openness, less isolation, some sort of normalization of ties with the rest, rather than, say, towards in a more authoritarian direction.
Now, you yourself have been a peacekeeper. You had long experience in the UN. You served in 3 peacekeeping missions, including in Cambodia, not too far from home. You also served, importantly, in the Secretariat on Peace and Security Issues. Myanmar today features a lot of internal tensions. The Rohingya question attracts the most international attention, but there are other tensions as well. And I wanted to ask you about what sounds sometimes like one peace process, but maybe several peace processes, because I think none of this is very well understood by the rest of us.
I think it's one of those stories where, because it's so complicated, it doesn't really attract the sort of media attention it deserves. I mean, in a way, it has been a success. I mean, Myanmar, I think if you had to categorize the history of Myanmar since independence in 1948 in 2 words, it would be civil war.
Yes.
I mean, this is a country which has seen some of the longest standing armed conflicts in the world. There are, by some counts, 18 different armed groups that have been battling the government that are still around, and over 2,000 local militia. Through this peace process, which was launched 2.5 years ago, the government has managed to sign ceasefires with 18 armed groups, and is now negotiating what it calls a nationwide ceasefire agreement. We're perhaps a month away from that agreement being realized and signed, and if it was, it would be a watershed moment in the history of the country. But it would only be a ceasefire agreement, and it would be at the beginning of a political talks process, perhaps leading to constitutional changes, perhaps leading to a federal system of government that would involve not just the belligerents on both sides, but also political parties and other political leaders. And this would be an incredibly complicated process. It's very difficult for me to think of a peace process in recent times that has included so many different sides, as well as so many different neighboring countries and others who might be involved.
Indeed. Now, I'd say the single confrontation that seems to attract the most media attention internationally, it must be more kinetic than the others, has to do with Muslim populations close to the Bangladesh border, and a sense of rejection of them by Buddhist groups led by a rather bellicose Buddhist monk. And of course, that's counterintuitive to those of us from the rest of the world, because we always think of Buddhists as peaceful and prophets of peace. Could you tell us a bit about that situation?
I think in a way there are 2, perhaps 3 different strands at work, not entirely connected, but not entirely the same. The first is what you mentioned before, the situation in the Western Rakhine state with a long-standing Muslim minority there, as well as another minority, the Buddhist Rakhine minority.
Yes.
And it's always difficult when you have 2 minorities, and again, the situation becomes too complicated to explain very easily. But there's a history of violence between these 2 communities that go back at least to the Second World War, where they were armed by both sides of the conflict at the time, by the Allies and by the Japanese. History of insurgency in that area. And really, I wouldn't say ancient ethnic hatreds, but it's a long-standing ethnic conflict that goes back now a couple of generations. There's a perception on one side that this situation has been fueled in part by illegal immigration from Bangladesh, something that's rejected by the leadership of the Muslim communities there. But that is quite different from the sporadic communal violence between Buddhists and Muslims that we've seen in the center of the country, where I think there is at least the possibility of political manipulation involved, of local political people trying to gain from these bouts of communal violence, where there is certainly a history of prejudice, but certainly also a long history of these communities getting together very well, and friendship on both sides, and many reasons to be optimistic that if it wasn't for any further political manipulation, that we wouldn't see that kind of communal violence in the future. The third are the Buddhist monks and others who come from really a very long tradition of feeling that Buddhism is under threat and that Buddhism is something that needs to be protected. And this is something that is unique. It's not unique to Myanmar. It's also a line of thinking one finds in Ceylon, in Sri Lanka.
Yes, indeed.
And it's not a coincidence that Myanmar Buddhism and Sinhalese Buddhism have been very closely tied for centuries now. So that is a separate sort of intellectual trend that again perhaps feeds into the way people think about the other two conflicts, but again is somewhat separate as well.
Well, you make clear that the vision that most of us had of Myanmar's struggle, essentially what we saw was Aung San Suu Kyi, brave, heroic, democratic, opposing a junta, as you were saying earlier, whereas in fact, while all of that was true, there was a great deal else that was true that we knew nothing about. Hence the importance of your books, which bring out a lot of this, and also of situating Myanmar in its neighborhood and in Burmese history. So the historian in you, and you have a PhD from Cambridge in history, you taught history there, the historical dimension is so important, and I think journalism rarely makes much place for history because it's complicated. So thank you for bringing that out with us. Finally, for our viewers, I wanted to mention that in one of your jobs in Yangon, you're very passionate about preserving the heritage of the city of which was known as Rangoon, today Yangon. Extremely difficult to do, and yet you're working very hard to do it. Could you tell us in a few words about the challenge and why you are devoting yourself to it heart and soul?
I mean, it began almost as an aesthetic thing. I didn't want to see these beautiful old buildings, hundreds of whom remain in downtown Yangon, destroyed.
As they've been in so many Asian cities.
And that would be the default thing, especially if we see economic growth now in the years to come. And I felt we were at a tipping point in that way. So I simply wanted to preserve these buildings. But this process or this involvement has now taken me in two very different directions. One is I realized quite early on that one cannot even begin to think about saving these buildings outside of an urban planning framework. And I'm not an urban planner by background. And there is no urban planning, or there hasn't been any urban planning in Myanmar. So it took me in the direction of thinking about much broader urban planning issues, whether it's housing or transport or the land, the use of urban land, and trying to help or work with the government in thinking about the urban planning challenges that Yangon, as a city of 5 million, which could grow to 10 million in the coming years, will almost certainly face. But it also took me in a completely different direction, which was to try to use this project to get people to appreciate that Yangon was a great cosmopolitan city, and that being a multi-ethnic, multi-faith, multicultural city is actually a great asset and something that they should be proud of and recognize. And related to that, to try to recover so much of the history that's been lost because of the way in which education or people have been taught under the military regime, and to recover this very different past of Yangon as perhaps, if not a guide, then at least something to think about in looking at options for the future as well.
Well, I'm thrilled you're doing it because I have seen so much heritage all over Asia and indeed the rest of the world plowed under. And having visited Rangoon a number of years ago, I remember thinking what an extraordinarily charming city it was, beautiful on the river, a lot of greenery, low slung, and increasingly cities are not low slung. So I wish you well with it. It's a tough battle because you have opposing you all sorts of economic interests, but I think you must have a lot of support also locally. So for our viewers, a bit of a taste of Thant, who normally can be found in Yangon. I hope some of you will be drawn to supporting his work on heritage there, supporting other development efforts in Myanmar. This really is both its hour of opportunity and its hour of need, which makes it exceptionally exciting because it has opened up and so much is possible now that was not possible before. Thanks so much, Thant,
Thank you very much,
being
David.
with us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Great.